Tell you how we came into Foursquare. It was really a pretty amazing thing. My parents were lived, born and raised in England, and were converted to Mormonism in England by an evangelist.
Okay,
Okay.
that's perfect. How you started out was
Okay.
perfect. But okay, go ahead.
Okay. From where I left off, you mean?
No,
Or
just
started?
start
Okay.
over.
I want to tell you a little bit about how I got into Foursquare. My parents were born and raised in England, as well as all of their siblings, and were converted to Mormonism in England by a Mormon missionary. And they, along with some of their siblings, came to the United States after my mother was married in 1909 to join the Mormon Church. So my brothers and sister, who are 10, 13, and 15 years older than I, were all raised Mormon. But when I was 7, had moved from Santa Monica, where I was born and raised, over to Glendora for a couple of years. And it was during the Depression. Work was hard to get. My eldest brother moved back to Santa Monica to try to find work. And when he did, I, with my other brother and my mother, moved back to Santa Monica. But in the interim, he had met a young man from the Foursquare Church in Santa Monica. Dr. and Mrs. Dorrance were the pastors. So when my mom came down, when we came back, he loved it so much that we ended up going there when I was 7 and never went back to the Mormon Church. So I was raised in Foursquare because of that. So I see the hand of God in that all the way down the line too. I'm from a long line of Mormons, and but that's how I came into Foursquare when I was 7 years old, and I'm 79 now. So it's been 72 years, right, that I have been in Foursquare.
Okay, that's great. Tell us a little bit about. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you remember at Santa Monica Church?
Oh, it was a great church. I can remember.
I'm sorry. Can you just start off the Santa Monica?
I was born and raised in Santa Monica. My siblings were born out of state, but I was born and raised in Santa Monica. Went through high school there, clear through school there. And Dr. and Mrs. Dorrance, it was one of their, well, they were just in their 20s, which I didn't realize till I got older at that time. But they were great pastors, and I adored her. In fact, she is the reason I wanted to be a pastor's wife. I just thought that had to be the coolest, neatest thing in the world. I practiced leading songs before the mirror like her, and I just wanted to do everything just like she did it as a young kid, you know. So they were great, and they mentored me, and then I went from Santa Monica High when I graduated in June of 1942. Of course, the war was full blown by then. And so that September, I entered Life Bible College and moved into Los Angeles to go to school. I was 17 years old. And I lived along with the girl that later became my sister-in-law, Georgia Orr. We were roommates together at the home of Harold and Elsie Chalfant, and loved living there. That was a real picnic to live with them because he was such an interesting man, and we all loved him. He did all the youth camps for Foursquare, and that's where we first became acquainted when I was 13 and went to my first camp. So I went to Bible school. Then I was in a class called the Commandos because we were a war class. We thought everybody got to name their own class names, but basically Sister was the name, gave us the names. We were Commandos and Paratroopers and Semaphores and Eagles and all kinds of war names were the names of our classes. And she was one of our teachers, which we loved. She couldn't always be there, but when she was amazing, and we just loved having her there because she was so fascinating and so interesting and such a vibrant, amazing woman. I just adored her. We all did. And I can remember she had a bodyguard. They called her Tiny, but she was really a big woman. And after Sister would finish preaching, whether it was in the temple or teaching our class, she would be walking toward the platform to usher her off and back home again. They thought they were sustaining more years for her life. I understand that now that I'm older, but I always felt bad about it when I was younger. But I remember one night when she was teaching us, she waved her off and she said, "I'm going to pray with these students." And we were all down in front. And she came down and prayed with each one of us, and it was such an amazing, wonderful experience for us. And in those days, we marched into the temple in classes. We sat to the right of the platform out in the audience for the Sunday morning and Sunday evening services, primarily Sunday morning. Those days, we also had to take sermon notes, 2 services a week, and turn them in that next week to our class. But she was amazing. She just commanded without doing anything your focus. And she was flamboyant, there's no question about it. She used to come down when we had ramps then, and the choir sat on 2 sides of the platform. And she'd come down that ramp from the balcony with an armful of red roses, and we just thought, she's the most beautiful thing we ever saw in our lives, and she was. And she would come down, but before the service was over, because it was war years, she would call all of the service personnel to the platform, and then she would hand them all a rose and then pray for them. And it was a really beautiful, wonderful time. And she just was a amazingly special lady. I remember the years of the commissary where there was nobody ever turned away. She fed the world almost through there during those Depression years. I can remember Anthony Quinn, the actor, twice I heard him on television say, "I will never forget a woman called Aimee Semple McPherson who fed my family and clothed my family so we wouldn't starve to death because we were so poor. She saw to it we were taken care of," and he held her in really high esteem, which I thought was a pretty wonderful thing, to hear him say that. And she was indeed a woman that saw to the community, saw to the people around her. It didn't matter what color you were, it didn't matter what religion you were. She just fed people and cared for people. And during the war years, she sold war bonds. I went to one of her rallies. I can't remember in which park. It was down somewhere not too far from the temple. It was not Echo Park, but it was another big park, where she sold war bonds for the people to buy. She was a great salesperson, and for people to sign up and buy war bonds. So she was very involved and very sympathetic toward the war in which we were involved, and she just was an amazing, amazing lady. She truly was. And I loved her a lot.
No.
Sip of water there.
Can you tell me that story that you told me about could you go ahead and tell us more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Tell me that story that you told me about Charles Walkham, what he said about
Yeah.
Sister.
Charles and Esca Walkham were friends of my husband's and mine, and he was so funny. One time we were talking to him about the beautiful oratorios Sister wrote. They were magnificent. I was in the choir myself for some of those, and an angel way up there above the platform, way up on that high area. And he said Sister would call him like at 2 in the morning. She really didn't care what time it was. And she'd, "Now, Charlie, this is what I want you to write." And she'd go, da, 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 da. But this wasn't the actual thing, but she'd hum sentences of words, of tunes. And Charlie would be sitting there at 2 in the morning trying to write these all down on a piece of paper. And that's where a lot of the things that were involved in the oratorios were born, over the telephone with her talking to him and trying to get him to write the notes down for something she wanted in something particular thing she was writing. And the oratorios were marvelous. My brother-in-law, he wasn't then, but he is now, Norm Nelson, was her tenor soloist in Bells of Bethlehem and some of those way back when we were all teenagers. And so she was an exciting lady. She really was. And I can remember, I always used to think, boy, I'd hate to be a valedictorian, because you have to get up and speak from that pulpit in that huge, big auditorium. And she would pull her chair right around to the edge of the platform facing you. And she'd sit there and watch you the whole time you're speaking. Wouldn't that just freak you out? It would me, to have her that close and listening so intently to us. And I can remember one time when the ramps were still in, the orchestra pit was right down below the front there, and they moved all of that out to let the people in, because that place was full to the rafters every time there was a service. You had to go very early to get a place to sit. And she was speaking, one valedictorian was speaking one time, and she was sitting there listening, and there was a baby in the arms of its mother right down, just very close to her, right there at the front of the platform. And the baby was fussing. And she, with no fanfare, I don't think she even took her eyes off the speaker. She reached down, brought that baby up in her lap, quieted that baby, reached down, handed it back to its mother, so it wouldn't interrupt the young man doing the valedictorian speech. And I thought, that's amazing. She's such an amazing lady. She just had a command which was hers, and flamboyant she was. She was. And her illustrated sermons were amazing. I remember one in particular, and don't ask me what the sermon was about. I haven't a clue. But I remember what happened. She had a man named Hugh Glass, he was about 6'6", that worked and helped her around the temple. And he helped her in her illustrated sermons, just doing a little background work and all. He was kind of punchy. He'd been a sparring partner with Joe Louis, I think, and a little bit punchy, but he was a sweetheart, and he really wanted to help out. So she did a message one night on the goose that laid the golden egg, and of course she dressed in whatever was appropriate for that particular sermon. Well, there was a point at which a certain sentence she said, Hugh knew to flip a lever, and this goose, it was a huge, big mechanical goose. Oh, that was on the citrus. We get a lot of that.
Can you start off? I'm sorry. Can you start
That's
off,
okay.
Start off again. Can you start off again when you telling us about the man? I mean, when you said what his name was and the sermon.
Talked about her illustrated sermons. Okay. Are we ready? Okay. Her illustrated sermons were pretty amazing, and I remember one in particular because it was funny.
Hold on. You know what?
Okay.
Someone's
Airplane. Maybe. No, it might be somebody mowing a lawn. I don't know what it is. You pick all.
Oh, no. Is he going to be doing this for a while?
Yes, probably will. It's not next door, I don't think, because he works. It's got to be here. It's got to be, no, it might be over here. Is that, you going to hear all that little bit?
The background noise.
Well, we
picks up
can wait a
lot.
few minutes if you want to.
Let me go see if I can see what house he's at and see if
Yeah.
Let me just tell you a little bit about Harold Chalfant, the youth
Okay.
director, and that will give us
Okay.
a lead in, and then you can just tell us some of the stories.
Okay.
Just the ones that you related. That was really
All right.
nice.
Okay. Tell me when.
Go ahead.
Okay. I want to tell you a little bit about Harold and Elsie Chalfant. And I mention Elsie's name because I think without an Elsie, there never would have been a Harold. She was dedicated to his ministry and understanding, and you had to be, because Harold was an extremely busy man. He not only was director of all the youth, Foursquare wide, he was also director of missions. He had a dual job, and both of them are large within themselves. And we all adored him. It was such a picnic to live in that house when I was in Bible school. I started in my first camp, which was Radford. We didn't have Cedar Crest then. And up in the mountains, when I think I was 13 the first time I went, somebody paid my way, and I think it was like $7.95 back in those days, but we didn't have $7.95. Those were tough times during the war, during the Depression. But Harold was an amazing man. I remember him saying that he felt the need to start youth camps for the organization, for Foursquare. So he went to the powers that be, to the board, and they said, well, you can go ahead and start one if you want, but anything you go in the red, any money you spend over budget, it comes out of your pocket. And that's how he began the youth camps. And they still go on till this day, and hundreds and thousands of young people have been saved. He had such an immense burden for missions. He loved the mission field. And I would hear him sometimes crying and praying at night. I would hear him. And sometimes I think it was in his dreams even I could hear him. And he would go down to South America to Jack Anderson and the Anderson family these were all the missionaries when I was a kid, the Andersons and the Edwards and all of that group, the older generation. And down to Abiato, where they had to walk for miles in to get back to that camp where Jack lived all alone at that time. And he'd come home with these amazing, wonderful stories. And I can remember one time he was there, that's where he happened to be on this particular mission trip, and he was due home within a couple of days. Well, we girls went to night school, Georgia and I went to night school and worked days, so we had a really heavy schedule. And I had to get up for work at 5 in the morning to catch my ride to go to work down at the bottom of the hill from Kensington where they lived. And he was due, I thought he was going to be home sometime that day or the next day, and we were all excited about it. He always brought his little presents. I remember he brought his fuzzy llama slippers one time from Brazil, and he bought us little things and trinkets for my charm bracelet and so on. He'd bring us girls a little present home. So that morning, it was about 5:05, and all of a sudden, we girls were being dumped out of our bed, mattress, covers, pajamas, girls, the whole thing on the floor, and we broke up. And it was Harold, and he was just laughing. He had paid a cab driver double to get him home in time before he knew that alarm was going to go so he could dump us girls out on the floor. It was a fun place to live. We were teenagers, and we just had the best time there, and we loved it. And he had his whole upstairs of his home as well as his basement. He worked a lot in his basement. had all these beautiful artifacts from foreign countries, among which were a couple of Akish masks, he called them. One was white, one was black. They were on the wall, and they were ugly as they could be. And one night, we girls had crept up the stairs. We didn't get out of school till 10, so it was like 20 after 10:30 before we walked home from the temple up to where we lived. And he knew our habits. He didn't sleep much. He was just too full of energy. So he knew we would come into our bedroom, and there was a the mirror facing the hall was a little nightstand, and I was sitting there doing something, I'm not sure what. And all of a sudden, in the reflection in the mirror, I saw this horrible, big black head come around the corner on the floor. And I hollered and I jumped, and it was Harold. He was lying out there on his stomach with this silly mask on his face, looking in there to scare us, and he did a good job. He scared us good. But our whole lives were full of little things like that, living in that home. But mostly, I've always felt sorry for the young people who came after me because they didn't have a Harold. And I know they're youth ministers, and the people that have their camps are the same, as precious to them as he was to us for my generation. But he went through a really hard time later. He really wrecked his health because of all the hard work he did. And we would talk on the phone sometimes, and I'd say, Harold, this is after I was married, years after I was out of the camping program. I said, you are probably more responsible than any other single individual in the world for the people that are on the mission field, for the young people. You just wanted to pack and leave when he talked about missions. He was that kind of a speaker when he talked about missions. He was so emotional, and the tears would run down his face. And he came to our church to speak. He hadn't been doing a lot of speaking. And he came, we invited him to come speak for us. And I went up to my husband's office, and Harold was just pacing back and forth. I said, are you nervous? He said, oh, I am. I'm really nervous. And he said, I haven't done this for a while. And I said, you're going to be great. You're going to open your mouth just like you did when I was a kid, and God's going to fill it, and our young people are going to be just as blessed by you as I was as a kid. And it's exactly what happened. He started to speak, and our kids never moved. Our whole church never moved. They sat, they listened, and he could tell you how many light years every star was away from another star. He just knew the galaxies, and he had a photographic memory. He remembered all these 12 and 14 number of mile things, and he just preached his message about science and the Bible and the greatness of God and the goodness of God, and our kids were just as spellbound and just as blessed as I remember being when I was a kid in summer camp. He was an amazing man, and he gave his life for the gospel.
Can you say he was an amazing man?
He was an amazing man, and he gave his life literally for the gospel of Jesus Christ. He loved the Lord with every fiber of his being, and so did Elsie. And I worked with him, for him actually. I came back from evangelistic work in the South to work in the Crusader office, which was the house in which Sister had lived, the building that's there. And that's the building out of which we worked during when he was at the temple. And I worked on the manuals. They called them the manual. We sent out ideas for every youth leader. Crusaders. We were called Crusaders when my growing up years. And we sent manuals out to hundreds of churches where they would have some ideas what to do with their groups. We gave them 4 different Sunday ideas for their youth group and so on. And he was a part of that. But we lost an amazing soldier of the cross when we lost Harold. He was precious, and I so appreciated him and loved living in his home. And all the other kids were jealous because we got to live there, and that was pretty cool because it was such a picnic to live there, and such a blessing too. It was never any dull moments living under that roof. I tell you, it was amazing, and he just was such an important part. In fact, I think he probably was the greatest motivator for my life than anybody else in my life. And I'm sure if you talk to any person in my age bracket that knew Harold, they will tell you exactly the same thing. The camps were amazing and precious, and he did such a great job, and will forever live in our memories and in our hearts because he was.
Can you describe, like for someone like myself who was never in a camp meeting, when in that time period, can you describe what a camp meeting was like?
Like at the camps themselves or
Yeah, like
Victory
describe
Circle?
some of any aspect of the camps that you can remember. If you can describe some of
Yeah.
that.
We had, we had a huge amount of young people went every year to the camps. They had to have 3 or 4 to accommodate all the young people of us that went. We did everything kids did. The cabins were way out, way out. We had to wash in a basin outside of the cabin and go to another place to take a shower. And I can remember us kids would purposefully, we were 14, 15, 16-year-olds, would purposely giggle and talk because after lights out, after they played the Lord's Prayer and all this was done, we were supposed to be quiet, right? But oh no, we weren't the only ones. We'd giggle and talk and laugh, and eventually somebody would come, Roy Bell or somebody else that was on staff would come by and try to hush us up to, okay, girls, settle down in there now. Well, we knew if we kept it up long enough, Harold would come. So we would keep it up, and pretty soon Harold, he'd laugh. He wasn't sleeping anyway. He thought it was funny. But he'd come and say, now you girls got to settle down in there, and he'd get on our case, and we'd giggle and laugh. We got what we wanted. We got to have Harold come up and tell us to be quiet. And then the services themselves and the ball games, we were all very competitive. We girls from Santa Monica all dressed alike. We wore culottes, the same color and blouses, and made shirts for the boys. And several churches, San Diego and some of the others used to do that. And we'd play ball and we'd dress all alike and be together. And then Friday night was Victory Circle. We sat around there every night. But Friday night was especially precious because that was the night before we were going to leave to come home on Saturday. And at that time we had pine cones, and if there was something in our lives that we wanted to give back to the Lord or we hadn't been doing as well, we'd write a little note and stick it down behind the little portions of that pine cone. And then when we had sincerely prayed about it, we'd all go down and throw our pine cones in the fire, which was in the middle, and Harold would be there, and other staff members as well. Sister came one year and spoke to us, and she and Rolf was with her, and we thought that was really great. She was up in camp one year. And those were our camps, and they were a precious, precious, beautiful time. We came home so refreshed. I know years later when I was dating my husband, Harold asked me if I would come up and work for 3 weeks at the camp, helping take care of Joyce, his daughter, who was little then, and also help in the office, which I did. And always before when I'd go to camp, I hated it when camp ended because it was the highlight of our lives. We worked all year long, babysat, and everything we could do to get to camp. That was the big thing of our lives all year. And this particular time, though, I was in love and dating and engaged, and here I was, all those miles from my sweetheart. And he said to me finally, this is the first time I ever remember you wanting to go home from camp. Always before you wanted to stay through the second camp, you didn't want to go home. And that was true. I wanted to get home where he was, But he carried those camps. They built Cedar Crest. He would go up there. He didn't ask people to build it. He built with them. He would go up there and work and work and work to build those buildings. And the Chalfant Auditorium that is there now is part of his doing. And he was just an amazing man. I didn't get to go to Cedar Crest except for women's retreats. I was out of the camping age bracket by then. But Radford was, and we had a reunion there many years later. All of us old-time campers went up and had a reunion at Radford again. And it was almost like it used to be. It was just wonderful and precious, and we had a great time. So he was an amazing man, somebody that we'll always remember.
Can you tell me, do you remember when Sister came up, do you remember anything that she did or said, how
I really...
how her interaction was with any of the students?
I really don't remember what she said. That was maybe 15 years old. I don't remember that far back what she said. But I know she spoke to us around the Victory Circle, as a matter of fact. And Dr. McPherson was with her. Her son was with her. And that was a really precious time for us, too. It's the only time I remember in the years I went to camp, which weren't that many years when you consider by the time you're out of high school, you're in college camps, that I remember her coming. But that was a delightful thing to have her there for that service, and that was a really nice thing. But the camps were the fabric of our lives. We just really, so many of us were called into ministry at the camps, and Harold's vision. And I have a cassette tape of him I used to play once in a while in the car, and I try not to play it when I'm driving because he cries and it makes me cry, and I hear his voice again and I think, oh, I wish he were here to minister to our kids again, you know, because he was one of a kind. He was a very unique man, and he and Elsie were so dedicated to youth and to missions, and they started out hard. I remember he was telling me one time, he said, Elsie and I, when we were first married, we used to get our tithe, and then we'd sit and pray over it that God would multiply it and help us to live off after we'd given our tithes, because none of us made very much money in those days. And so you know, he just grew up with that kind of a sacrificial heart, and he kept that all his life. That was how his heart was. So it was an amazing thing.
That's great, and it's nice to have some information just about him personally. Tell me what you can remember about Charles Wacom.
Charlie Wacom was a terrific man. He played the piano like crazy, and he knew music, and he said that Sister would call him sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning and say, okay, Charlie, I have a song here. I want you to write this down, and he'd get his pencil and paper, and she'd be humming a melody over the phone. He's trying to write the notes on lines, you know, to this melody and words and all this stuff. And from that was born a lot of the writing that came from the oratorios, the Bells of Bethlehem, Regia Moderati, and some of those were birthed with Charlie and Sister back and forth, writing music and singing music and doing all this. And I can remember my father was an organist, and he also tuned organs and pianos. When Charlie would come to the Foursquare Church in Santa Monica, where I was growing up, and played the piano, my dad would sit with his hand kind of up at his head like this, and because Charlie really banged, my dad didn't bang. And on Monday morning, he said, well, I've got to go down to the church and tune that piano. Charlie Wacom was here last night, and he probably got the piano all out of tune. I don't think he did, but my dad would go down and check it out anyway. But yeah, he and Eska were precious and friends of my husband's and mine, and we appreciated and revered their friendship. And he had much, much, much to do with the oratorios in those days, which they don't have anymore, and they were so beautiful. I miss that type of thing. They were amazingly wonderful. The singers and all that they did were wonderful.
Do you remember at all how he led the choirs? I mean, kind of any of his mannerisms, how he interacted with you as choir members?
Not too much. Jimmy Boersma was the orchestra leader in those days, a band leader, and Charlie. I'm trying to think if Charlie was our choir leader. I really don't remember that, to tell you the truth.
So he just arranged the music, and then Jimmy Boersma.
Primarily for the oratorios and the big productions that they put on there at the temple, like around Christmas time, the Bells of Bethlehem, and some of those things. I don't know if they have those things on video. Well, they didn't have videos then. I don't know if they have any record of those things. But they were amazing. The staff of characters were amazing. And my brother-in-law, Norman Nelson, was only 17, 18 years old in those days, and he was her tenor soloist. He did Gabriel and some of the other roles, and he was her soloist there. He also was her soloist in Oakland when she passed away.
Tell me what you remember about some of those operas or oratorios.
Well, they were so well acted, and they had the voices, the ones that had lead voices, of course, had to be good. And there were angel choirs. I know I was part of the one that stood way up on the high peak above. And then they had them down along the sides, and then people sometimes in the ramps coming down. And they just were, there was a lot of memorization went into that. We did not hold books. You had to memorize. Plug that.
About the angels?
Where was I?
Yeah, talk about, let's talk about
we all had to memorize our music and our words, of course.
You know what, can you start again? I think I was talking when you...
Oh, we all had to memorize our words, of course, because we didn't hold books. We had a large choir there, which encompassed both sides of the platform. The choir lofts were on the left and on the right of the platform, which was a little difficult for the leader, because he may have altos and sopranos here and basses and baritones over here. So he or she, whoever was leading, had to kind of work that in, along with the orchestra, which was right in the middle of all of this. It was a pretty big job. And but we always had a full choir and a tremendous cast of characters, and the stories were done so beautifully. And one thing I always loved and admired about Sister was she never compromised her message. She may be flamboyant, she may be theatrical, and she was, but you never got out of that temple without hearing the plan of salvation, the redemption by the cross, the blood of Jesus, the mercy of God. She never compromised her message. She may have gone a different way around to put it there, but God gave her that special talent. She's a little woman. I think a lot of people don't realize she's only like 5'2" or 5'3". She wasn't a big woman, but she had a big message and a very distinct voice. You always knew when her voice, you heard her voice on the radio, who it was. There's never any mistaking that. And she was just, the music she wrote and the things she did, she just was a multi-talented lady. She couldn't sing too well herself, as I remember when she used to lead singing, but she knew music in her heart. And with Charlie Walken working with her, they put out a lot of beautiful stuff and a lot of amazing, amazing things. But I can remember, too, when I was living with the Chalfants, I don't know if I told you this, but the phone rang one day and I was the only one home. And so I answered it, and the minute I heard this voice, I knew it was Sister. And my little heart was just beating away. And she asked for Harold. I said, "I'm sorry, Sister, he's not home." And she said, "Are you a student?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she talked to me maybe 10 minutes, asked me what church I was from, did I work, how was I enjoying school, was there anything she could do for me. She was just darling and precious, and she and I just sat there and had the nicest chat. I was about 18 years old. And when Harold came home, I said, "You'll never guess who talked to me today." And he said, "Who?" And I said, "Sister. She called for you, but she talked to me, and we had the nicest talk. She was so darling and friendly and sweet." He said, "Well, she feels that way about the students, and she's really very lonely." I said, "How can she be lonely with as much as she has?" Is because she lives alone with Angela, who was her maid, her caretaker, in that great big house. I was in that home once, and it was a big house, and said she's there by herself most of the time, and she loves to be a part of the life of the students. She loves to be a part of anybody that's involved here, you know. And I thought that was such a sweet thing about her, to treat me that way as a student. It was a highlight for me and a blessing to me, and I never, ever forgot it. Along with the memory I had when I was about 10, we were called branch churches, and the temple was our mother church. And we would come in there from the branches, the different branches, to meet at the temple for meetings. You had to get there early. You couldn't get a seat. It was packed out. Many times I sat on the step. And she would preach these amazing, wonderful messages. But this particular day, somebody, I don't know who it was, came down the aisle, and they stopped at my aisle and said, "Would one of you children like to take the flowers up to Sister tonight?" And I said, "I would." And so he said, "Okay," and he picked me. Oh, I was so excited. I got to carry the flowers up to the platform and hand them to her, a huge bouquet of roses. And I remember she kissed me on the cheek, and then she turned her face like this, and I kissed her on the other cheek. And I thought that was so great. I just loved that little contact with her because we all adored her. But she was a humble, ordinary, just like us person. It's just that we saw her in a different light when she was on the platform, and that made it look more glamorous. But way down deep inside, she was just exactly like the rest of us, and probably just as scared as the rest of us about certain things, and apprehensive about certain things, but she never showed it. She was always in command, and always knew who she was and where she was, and we just loved her a lot.
Can you tell me, did she ever have the students over, or the workers, since you worked for Harold Chalfant, did she ever have them over to her house at all?
Um, Not the students, to my knowledge. I know I went there for a party. This was after she passed away, though, and Dr. McPherson was president. I went there for a party because I was on staff at that time working in the youth office in those days. But I don't remember that too much. I remember going to a baby shower at her house for her granddaughter, Kay. When Kay was expecting her first child, I remember going to a baby shower there for her. And Kay's still living. Marlene died when she was 23, I think. But I have a funny story about Marlene. Roy and Mary Ann McEwen were getting married at the temple. Georgia and Norman, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, got married there too. And of course, everybody stayed. The place would have 5,300 people there for your weddings, a lot of people. And I was in that wedding, but Roy and Mary Ann McEwen were getting married. And Dr. McEwen, his dad, it was at the point of the time, Sister married them, but it was the point of the time where he prayed for the couple. And they had just knelt, and all of a sudden, a drop came from up above on the platform. It was kind of a cheesecloth drop, and it fell, a big wooden board across the bottom of it. It fell right in between Sister and Dr. McEwen and the bride and the groom. It came right down between them. If it had hit him, it had killed him. And it fell down there, and I heard Sister on the microphone saying, "Keep praying, brother." And so we were watching, of course. We students were watching because it was amazing. And they finally got that thing. He kept praying, and they rolled that thing back up. And Marlene had been up there in the catwalk somewhere, and she had accidentally released that drop, and it fell right down between Sister and Dr. McEwen and the bride and the groom. But they were kneeling, so it came between them, so they got their lives saved. But that was a funny incident I remember happening there on a Sunday, too. It was interesting.
That is interesting. I've never heard that one.
Yeah.
That reminds me. Can you tell me a little bit about? I know it's very common for people to get married after evening services.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just tell me a little bit about that? Did you and your husband do that too?
No, we were married, however, by Harold Chalfant, and so were George and Norman. He came to Santa Monica to marry us.
Can you tell us just about them, like what it was like being in a service when someone got married? I remember what Hicks was saying that when she married them, it was like at 10 o'clock at night by the time she actually got to the wedding.
Yeah, it was late.
But could you just kind of like anything that you?
I remember 3 weddings there.
Sorry.
Okay. I remember 3 weddings at the temple on Sunday nights after the service, and so they had a humongous amount of people, many of whom didn't know them that well, the bride and the groom, but they stayed for the wedding because they were always fun. George and Norm were married there, and I know I sang for their wedding. I was also matron of honor. So I had to scoot out after I sang and get up to walk down that ramp, and I can remember we girls all raked our shoes with a knife because the ramp was slick, and we were coming down that ramp, we didn't want to fall, and to get down onto the platform. And then I also remember Paul McEachern and getting married there. And she had beautiful their girls were, I think they had 8 or 9 or 10 bridesmaids. They were all in bouffant hoop skirts and blue satin. They carried parasols. And I can remember seeing all them come down from that ramp. It was really pretty. And they would come down the platform, and Sister would be here, and also whoever else was assisting in the wedding, In George and Norman's case, Harold Chalfant married them as well as us later. But it was exciting, and sometimes it was late at night. By the time the sermon was over and the altar call was given, then we have a wedding. So it frequently was very, very late. But I remember those particular weddings, Roy and Mary Ann McEwen, George and Norman Nelson, and Paul McEachern, Paul and his wife. And I knew all these people before they ever married one another. In fact, Mary Ann and Roy were in my class in Bible school. And I knew Paul from Lubbock, Texas, before they were married. Chris McEachern, she used to be Christine Jones, and he married her, Chris McEachern. And all of us are grandmas and great-grandmas now, many times over, so. But the weddings were fun. They were an exciting addition. Everybody stayed. Nobody seemed to want to go home. They got in on a wedding. They stayed anyway, so it was fun and exciting. Yeah.
Was it common back then for people to have receptions like they do now? Did they just get married and then go off?
Yeah, not the same. I remember when George and Norman were married, we had showers for them before the wedding. And there was a reception, but they were totally cake, punch, and coffee receptions. Nobody gave dinners like they do now, thank goodness, because none of us would have been able to afford. They'd have had peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at any of our weddings, I'm sure, because nobody had any money in those days. We were eking our way through Bible school and working and trying to get through school. And but they would have cake receptions, and mints and tea and coffee and punch. That was about the limit. I never knew anybody to have a sit-down dinner or a big buffet or anything like that until many, many, many years later. Of course, you got to remember we were right in the middle of the war. I can remember when George and Norm got married, the thing they got the most of was Pyrex. It had just come out. And things were very hard to buy. You have to remember, like, during the war, we didn't even get Hershey bars anymore because they needed the foil for the war. We were rationed on many different things, and we went to Bible school. We skipped one whole semester almost because we went all summer so the boys would not be drafted during the summer vacation time because the draft was on. And there were lots of things during the war that were different because they weren't accessible. You had to use what you could lay your hands on and do what you could do, during those war years. And we were in school all those years. I graduated in March of 45, and the war ended shortly after that. And I went in 42, so we were at the height of two wars on both continents when we were students. So things came a lot harder sometimes to some of us than they did. There's certain things you just couldn't get. I can remember one of the rules in the Bible school was the girls had to wear hose. Forget you never wore pants. I remember I worked at Douglas during the war, and I had to wear slacks. And I said to everybody that would hear me, when I'm through working here, I'm never wearing slacks again. I hate to wear these, and now this is about all we wear. But in those days, we wore dresses and skirts to school, and we had to wear nylons. Actually, we wore silk stockings until the war, and then they needed the silk for parachutes and things like that, and that's when nylons were born. And we were instructed to freeze them first. You put them in your freezer and freeze them. This is supposed to last. It didn't help at all. They ran like crazy. And we had little kits we had. You could try to knit the runners. And you couldn't find nylons. Every time you saw a line anywhere during the war, you got in it hoping maybe they were selling nylons. Half the time it was cigarettes or something else. But we were always hoping we could find. You couldn't find nylons, but we had to wear stockings to school or we got demerits. So we just had to wear cotton ones or whatever we could find to wear, because nylons were so hard to come by, and long gone were the silk stockings by then. We couldn't get it. And those days they all had a seam up the back. They weren't the nude stockings like they have now. But they were interesting days, the war days in Bible school. We were extremely patriotic. And Sister really fostered and encouraged that in everybody. There was always flags waving and cheers given to the servicemen and things done for them. We were extremely patriotic and devoted to the war effort. And we're very willing to go without certain things to see that they were fed well. And I miss that patriotism now that we had then for our country. It was a thing to behold, I tell you. Yeah.
Anything else about just that time period that you can remember? I mean, what are some of the other things that people did, not necessarily Bible college students, but just people in general? What did they do
for the war effort?
Yeah.
During the war, we had a meatless Tuesday. I remember nobody ate meat on Tuesday, and you had to have coupons. In fact, I still have a couple of our ration books. They don't say on them what the stamps were for. I wish they did, but we had to get meat. With ration, we had to get shoes. If you had small children that went through their shoes much more quickly than an average child, sometimes you could go to the board and get another shoe stamp. There were so many things rationed to a sugar, so many things that we had a hard time getting our hands on. So people learned to adjust to what they cooked and what they fixed, and in order to give up what we needed to give up for the war. And like I said, Hershey bars, foil was, I can remember collecting foil and making it into little balls because you could hardly find it. We'd see how big we could get the foil ball. Because Hershey bars and things that were wrapped in foil were no longer accessible because that was needed for the war effort, and silk was needed for the war effort. And you just learned to adjust and do without. And a lot of people worked in, we call them victory gardens. People planted victory gardens for their vegetables. So they could save money and do that. Sometimes there were a communal garden. People would get together and plant. And just all kinds of things we did. And we're happy to do it. It was no sacrifice for us because we were helping our boys who were in service. I can remember when I was 18, I could give blood finally. I had to wait till I was 18.
Start over again.
I can remember when I was 18 and I could finally give blood for the war effort. And I can remember going to the blood bank and giving my first pint of blood. And I can remember lying there pulsing those things to make the blood flow and saying every boy I knew who was in the armed forces, boys I had known in high school, and boys that I had known from my church that were gone. And I can remember saying their names every time I would squeeze my hands that I was giving to them. And I went then every chance I had after that. But that very first time I went, I forgot you're supposed to eat afterwards. And so I wanted to get back to the temple because they were having a special service. So I started down the stairs to go into the ladies' room, and the commissary was right there. I was 18, and all of a sudden I began to get dizzy, and things began to get black, and I was hanging onto the railing. So I headed for the commissary because I knew somebody would be in there. I remember I ran into a door. There were lots of open places, but I hit a door. And the ladies jumped up and grabbed me and sat me down, and I said, I just gave blood. And they said, oh, my goodness, give this girl something to eat. So they fed me something and got me back on my feet, and I made it back to the service I didn't want to miss. That's why I hadn't eaten. I wanted to get back to Angel's Auditorium for a service that was going on there. But everybody did this. We all gave blood and did everything we could toward the war effort, bought war bonds and everything we could do to help the war effort.
Before I forget, can you tell me that story again about Sister and the baby? Kind of started off so we know why,
Yeah.
The setting of why she was sitting.
You want me to go back to where she always pulled her chair up?
Yeah.
Okay. I would have hated to have been a valedictorian in the days of Sister McPherson because they stood behind this enormous podium for one thing, but then she would pull her chair way over to the very edge of the platform, where just a couple of feet from the pulpit, where she could sit and watch the face of the person that was speaking. Would that terrorize you or what? And she was so in command, and the people, they would see her, but she paid no attention to the audience. She was riveted on the person, the girl or the boy that was speaking, and she'd say amen, and that's good, brother or sister, and hallelujah, and just encourage them on. But also the place was so packed with people that they cleared the area where the band had been and brought chairs in. And right on the very front there of the altar, because she was right by the edge of the platform, there were chairs, and there was a woman there one night when I was there for a graduation who had a small child, a baby, and the baby got fussy. Now, I think if Sister had been preaching, she would have ignored it, but she wasn't. She was interested in this young man being able to not have any distractions. I remember watching her. She just reached down. She never took her eyes off the boy that was talking. She just reached down like this, and the woman handed her the baby just as willingly as anything. And she brought that baby back and put it in her lap and jiggled it and patted it for a minute or two, and it quit crying. Then, without taking her eyes off the speaker again, she went back and handed that baby back to the mother, and it was quiet from there on. But she just, there was a commanding presence about her that was uncanny. She didn't try to make herself notice. That was a perfectly innocent little thing she did. She didn't want this kid distracted. She didn't try to get noticed. She just was, because she was a presence all in herself. And I remember when she died, it just broke our hearts. And it was with total disbelief that we had to accept that kind of news. I was coming out through what we always called the Iron Gate from Bible school that morning, and a girl approached me. She said, did you hear that Sister died? And I said, no, she couldn't have died. Up in Oakland? She said, yes. And I said, why? And they didn't know anything at that time. And I thought, this can't be true. This has got to be a rumor. So I went to a phone and called Harold up at the house, and he was crying. He said, yes, it's true. And I can remember the overwhelming feeling of, what are we going to do now? What can we do without her? We were all in such disbelief. And I remember Dr. McPherson, who was not ready for this. This was as big a shock to him as it was to everybody. I remember he and Lorna D. stepping into that extremely difficult role. And what a precious couple they were to lead our organization through that terribly hard time. I don't know how they did it. Lorna D. and I were friends, and we used to talk back and forth on the phone and chat about things, and I know how difficult it was for her. She was a far cry from being an Aimee Semple McPherson. She was Rolf McPherson's wife, darling and precious, and very very animated, but very like all the rest of us were, you know. And they stepped into a amazingly remarkable breach to fill that area when Sister passed away so suddenly. There was no warning, no preparation, no saying, okay, we'll do this if it happens, because nobody expected it. And it was an extremely hard thing to live through. I remember her funeral with people lined up down every block and around the blocks while she was lying in state before her funeral on October 9th of 1944. And they were lined up forever. It was hours, all night long, people coming back and forth by her casket. And the flowers were everywhere, up and down the ramps and all over the platform. So many beautiful bouquets and so many dignitaries that came for that viewing. I didn't have to wait in line because we knew Harold, and he got us in through the back and took us in early where we could go in. But she looked beautiful in death as well as she did in life. And but it was, I can remember thinking, what are we going to do next? What happens to us now? Our shepherd's gone. Where do we as sheep go? You know, we just felt so vacant by her absence, and that she wasn't going to come back and teach us anymore. We weren't going to see her on the platform anymore. Was an overwhelming grief. It was just amazing. And I can remember I ran out and bought I don't know where I got the money now that I think about it, every newspaper I could lay my hands on. I got them from other people. And I made a scrapbook of funeral clippings. I had a big book just full of funeral clippings, and then after her death, and then the funeral, and then after the funeral at Forest Lawn, and so on. And about 3 years or so ago, I gave it to my pastor, who wasn't around when Sister was, and I said, here, I think you'll enjoy this and appreciate this more than my kids would, and so I want you to have it for his Foursquare memento collection. And I gave it to him, and he was delighted. And I said, you show this to some of the students from Life Now that want to know anything about her death and her life. Show this book to them, because there were article after article, not always flattering. People took that opportunity to bring up everything bad anybody had ever heard, none of which I believed anyway, but they took that opportunity at her death to do that.
Can you, do you remember any of the illustrated sermons? Can you?
Did I tell you the one about Hugh Glass? I did tell you that earlier, didn't it?
Yeah, that was the only one.
That's the only one I remember.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
the only one I really remember. I remember she had something about a milk pail once, and she was dressed in a little Dutch outfit. But I don't remember. I remember that because it was so funny. That faux pas was so funny. She laughed too, because you couldn't get that stupid egg out of that
Oh,
goose.
you know what? You started saying that. I think that's one that the
Oh,
cutters
was
came.
that?
Okay, yeah,
You want me to go back and say it?
I remember because you didn't.
I feel I'm off course. I'm jumping back and forth. Is that
that's
hard
okay.
for you?
No, that's fine.
I can remember Sister's illustrated sermons, one in particular. She always, more frequently than not, when she came down the ramp with her arms full of roses, she had a long white dress on, sometimes a uniform, sometimes just a beautiful dress, mostly a uniform. And she came to the platform. But when she was going to have an illustrated sermon, she dressed like whatever the sermon was. One time she was a milkmaid, kind of had a Dutch outfit on. But this particular time, I don't remember what she wore. But her message was on the goose that laid the golden egg. And do not ask me what the message was about. I have not a clue. All I remember is something funny that happened during that message. She had a man who went to school, but he also worked around the temple that helped her with these. His name was Hugh Glass. He was about 6'6", I think. He was huge. And he's a little punchy because he'd been a sparring partner for Joe Louis, as I remember somebody telling me. But he was a sweetheart, and he did everything he could to help. It was his job on her sermon that night. She had this enormous, must have been out of metal or something, goose on the platform, a huge, big thing. And there was a golden egg up inside that goose. And at a certain point in her message, Hugh was to hit a little mechanism that dropped the egg onto the floor, onto the platform. Well, she got to her point, okay, and she said it very distinctly, and nothing happened. So she said it again, and nothing happened. So the third time she said it again, and about that time you saw Hugh Glass, his hand come out, the mechanism malfunctioned. He just reached in, opened that thing, took that egg, and dropped it down on the platform, and it was so funny that I can't remember what she said other than that illustration about that. She, no doubt, she had everything always in her command. She no doubt really covered that up well, or had something humorous to say about how that happened. She would have associated that spiritually with something, because that's how she was. But I remember that particular illustrated sermon. All of us as students were sitting over there in one area, and we just cracked up. It was so funny. And Hugh was so embarrassed because he couldn't get that egg to come out any other way, so he pulled it out of that goose. He was going to get that egg to the platform one way or another. But it was fun, and her message was delightful. And
Was there anything else that you remember? Any particular setting that you might have seen her in, or anything that she might have said to? Not,
just when she came
you.
and taught us,
I'm sorry.
or
Can you start again? I was
oh,
talking.
I'm sorry. Only when she came to speak to us when we had her as a teacher. She loved those students. They were really a lifeline to her, I think. And she was always so proud and so deeply interested in everything that concerned everybody there. And it was her joy to come down and pray, which, as I said, she didn't get to do very often because they ushered her away. Had we known she'd have passed away at age 53 and buried on her 54th birthday, they may have let her stay a little longer. They thought they were preserving her life and helping her to live a longer time. But when she would break away and say, no, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, then they stepped back and let her do it. And that happened a lot at the temple. When after her sermons, people were down at the altar, she would come down and pray with people. And she'd lead singing. I can remember her leading Preach the Word and so many of these amazing songs in her long flowing cape and her long white dress and her Foursquare shield, which we all had to have too, I might say. We couldn't graduate unless we had a long white dress, a short navy blue dress, a shield, and a cape, lined cape. Very hot in the South, which is where I went. Very hot. No air conditioning down there in those days. And but I just see her face, and I can think of her now and exactly what she looked like. All these years later, there's a total memory of exactly what she looked like, her height, her face, her mannerisms. I still remember vividly from when I was a kid under her ministry, and I was 19 when she died. So
Let me ask you: if someone asked you about any of those things that you said you remember, how would you describe them to someone?
I had an opportunity to describe her actually to people once, because I was working at the time. I had switched to day school for that one semester, and happened to be in day school when she passed away. And I worked part-time. When I went to my job that day, my back was to most of the other girls, and there were 2 or 3 girls in there that knew she had died. By this time, everybody knew. And they made very snide and cruel remarks. And I can remember standing where I was working, and the tears just bouncing off my face and running down onto my shirt. But I never turned around. I never said a word. I just stood there with the tears flowing because I was so hurt. Feeling so bad already, I just heard the news, and I had to go to work. And several of the other girls came over to me and said, we're so sorry. Told the girls to shut up and said, we're so sorry. We don't all feel that way, and we want you to know our hearts are sympathetic. We know you must be going through a hard time. And they were really sweet. And I said, you know, you should have known her. I said, if I ever in a lifetime do one smidgen of what she's done for the gospel of Christ, I will consider myself as having done well. This woman made such an impact on just not here, but on the world. Because for openers, she was a woman, and nobody expected a woman could do all that, for one thing. And because she was so consistent and so determined and so tenacious about her ministry, she never wanted to be called the Foursquare organization. We were a movement. We were a Foursquare movement, which meant we kept moving. We went to foreign fields. We moved in our areas. We did things as unto God through the Foursquare movement, not the organization. She never liked that word. And I had an opportunity then, and I have since then, to just say what a dynamic woman she was, and how very special she was. And it didn't take being around her very long for her to get into your heart. It just kind of came that way.
You know, I don't know how much of that.
Oh, that's another one.
Go
Oh,
on.
gosh.
I really like what you said about we're a movement, not an organization.
Yes.
And I want to catch that, but I don't know how long these guys are going to mow the lawn.
I don't know where they are. This is different guys. I don't know where they are. Maybe over here.
Someplace, yeah.
That little bit, it's not here. We know that. It's not right here. Will that little bit pick up on there?
How much is it? How much can you hear them?
Sounds like an airplane almost.
Well, as long as they keep quiet, they were just loud right at the very end. Let's try to do it. I just, you know how sometimes.
Well, we should be about through. My goodness,
Yeah,
I've
we
been talking
are.
a long time.
But you know how sometimes it made a little, like right now it's a little noisier than
Mhm.
it was just a minute ago. Let's see if he'll get quiet, a little quiet. 'Cause I really.
As they're coming closer on the lawn to wherever we are here, probably.
That's it.
Mhm.
That's it.
Yeah.
Maybe if they get further away, we can.
This must be lawn mowing day for all these people. I never
Yeah,
noticed
I think
it.
a lot of people do. I never thought about it, but I guess they do for the weekends.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Probably. They just come every other week here
Oh.
to mow my lawn. But
Yeah, no, I suppose. You know, let's just kind of say those last things you did before.
what were we talking about?
About Sister, she never planned to be an organization. She talked about she was a movement.
A movement, yeah. Yeah, the Foursquare Gospel, which is where she started, with planning what the Foursquare Gospel was. And that's what she was doing in Oakland. When she died, she went back to the place of her origin in preaching this message, and she was so happy to be back preaching it again after all those many, many years when the Foursquare, quote unquote, was born into her heart as to what to call this movement. And she never called it an organization. It was always a movement. And I've told my pastor that many times. And that is really the theory. I think Jack Hayford calls it that, too. It was not supposed to be an organized thing. It was supposed to be a movement that spread, not just in the U.S., but foreign countries, which it has. Look at the mission stations we have now. And the way she began her ministry. The temple was started 2 years before I was born. In 1923, I was born in 1925. And then when I was 7, we were introduced to this, and it was just going strong then. As I said, the ramps were there, and you could go all the way up to that second balcony. We always called it the third balcony because it was the third layer. And they were packed to the walls every time, and people putting chairs out. And every time those doors opened, it was like that. Plus, she spent hour upon hour upon hour in the 500 room praying for people. And she had dozens of services every week. I mean, she just didn't preach on Sunday. She was going all the time. She's trying to teach in Bible school. She had the 500 room there. She preached a lot in Angel's Auditorium. Things were going on all the time with her. And it's no wonder, I'm amazed she stayed as healthy as she did, because she really wore herself thin. Happily in preaching the word and telling people about Jesus. And that was her thrust, and that was her heart, and that's where she came from, and that's what you accepted when you sat under her ministry. The heart of this woman was just bursting with desire to preach the word and to tell people about Jesus, and nothing was too hard for her. She undertook stuff, that most women wouldn't have the stamina to do. Like I said, during the war, when she'd go out and raise money for bonds, war bonds, and she'd get in parks, and she just was something. She really was something amazing.
You know what? If I can just give that statement really concisely about the movement again, because I want to use it for something. If you can just say, Sister always talked about Foursquare as being a movement, not an organization, because she always wanted to be on the move. I mean,
right.
If you can just kind of say just that concisely and just that
okay.
would be perfect.
Sister never wanted Foursquare to be called an organization. Her heart was that it was a movement. This was her message, that she moved and the word moved and stretched out into other lands and other countries. This was her burden and her desire, that we were a movement. That means you never stand still. It means you keep moving and conquering new areas and doing more and more, and that was her heart.
Okay, I think that will work. Let me ask you, if you would, what is close with this? If you would have a message to ministers today, or people going into the ministry, what would be your advice, or what would be your message to them?
I think people graduating from Bible college in this day and going into ministry should have the same drive I had at age 20 when I left school and went into ministry. And that is that you have all kinds of faith because that's about the only thing that's going to keep you going. We didn't have money. We barely got from one meeting to another when I was in ministry. And we didn't care. That wasn't the purpose of our going. We just wanted to touch people for Jesus. And I think people in this day and age sometimes think they should step right into a pastorate, right into an established church, right into a well-founded something or other where they'll make a salary. I think you just need to go by faith and trust God, because God never fails. He never failed me. I had to write home for money once to come home from Texas on the bus, but I got home. And sometimes you just need to have that kind of faith and know that God will provide. If He's called you, He'll provide. He doesn't call you to a ministry where He doesn't give you the provision to take care of that ministry. That's just what He does. That's just who He is. And I think people graduating today should have that kind of a vision. I'm going here, I'm not sure how I'm going to land, but I'll land on my feet, and God will supply my needs, because He said He would supply our needs according to His riches and glory by Christ Jesus. And that promise has never changed from my generation to their generation. It's still the same promise, and He's still the same Lord.
And if you would say, what was Sister's greatest accomplishment, what would you say that was?
Oh, gosh. She had so many. I think just following the will of God for her life. I think the call of God in her life after she came back from China after Robert Semple had died, she brought baby Roberta back to the States again as a widow, a young widow from a missionary husband. I think when God called her to do what she did when she came to Los Angeles in those meetings, had to be her constant focus. This was God's call on her life. If she could accomplish just that, just getting that place built, and preaching to the people, which she did in tents for years. My mother-in-law sang for one of her meetings when she was in Denver, Colorado, way back in her very beginnings. And if she had accomplished that, I think she just lived with that kind of victory in her life all the rest of the time through her ministry, and knew God was too big for anything. Was too small for anything, but was big for everything. And everything that you ask Him in His name and faith believing, He would give. And she lived with that kind of a premise. She lived that way. That was her message, and that's how her life was lived.
Great. Is there anything else you want to say before we
Oh, no, I
stop?
think I'm tapped out. I think I've said too much. You're going to have to do a lot of cutting on this one.
No, that was great.
Oh. We did. Several of us went to the same high school. We ran together. We also had other friends. But it was really a very close-knit thing. And you never went to church. I lived during the days of revival. We had one revival meeting after another, sometimes 2 weeks long, 3 weeks long. And I don't think we had the homework kids have now. We couldn't have to do what we did. But if my mother wanted to punish me, she'd have made me stay home, not make me go. Because I wouldn't want to miss one night of anything that was going on. And I took my homework. If I had homework, I took it, and I did it during the song service so I could be ready for the message. And we got very little. Sometimes we didn't get home till midnight or late because the altar calls were so amazing with the evangelists. I lived in a day of real revival, one after another we had in our church all year long, every year. And of course, as I said, the war years put a different twist on things, I think, too, because people were afraid. You could walk down our streets in Santa Monica during the war. You're not taping this, are you? We could walk down the streets in Santa Monica during the war. All the lamp posts only shone a small part on the face away from the beach. Everything else is painted black. If you're walking from the beach back, you saw no light. When the blackout sirens raids started, we had to stop wherever we were. Lots of times we were out walking home or in the middle of nowhere. You know, if I were driving, you just pulled your car over and stopped and sat it out. You never knew when the all clear was going to sound. And I can remember as a girl in Santa Monica, as a teenager there, I'd hear the air raid sirens. Of course, we were a beach city, and we had areas that were patrolled, and we had air raid wardens that patrolled every block. And the minute it started, you pulled your air raid shades, which were black, so no stream of light. If there was a little bit of light coming out anywhere, the air raid warden would knock on your door and say, "We can see light through your window," and would correct us on it. I remember working at Douglas. The top of it looked like a city. It was camouflaged. It looked like a city up on top of that plant at Douglas. And you would just have to sit it out till the all clear sounded. It was black as pitch. There were no light anywhere. But I can remember lying in bed at night during that time, and I would hear airplanes. The air raid thing would go off, and I'd hear these airplanes. And I'd say, I get under the blankets and I say, "Oh God, let them be ours. Don't let them be the enemy. Don't let those planes." And you never knew. Of course, I lived right by Douglas Aircraft. Lots of planes around there, and they hit the air the minute those, and they stopped things on the coast. There was a submarine out there one time they got before it hurt us. People don't realize it came that close sometimes to the shores of America, that the war came that close. They got a Japanese sub out there one time, and so it was a whole different way of growing up. We didn't expect anything. We'd gone through a depression where we didn't have anything. Now we're in the middle of a war. We still didn't have much of anything. So all my growing up years, from the time I was a little girl, the stock market failed in 1928. I was 3 years old. So I grew up all those depression years. The war brought us some prosperity, in as much as we had to open so many plants. And we as women all went to work for defense plants because so many of the boys were gone. But that brought us what little prosperity we ever had known. But most of us were two dress girls. We had a dress for Sunday and a dress for other times. We didn't have many clothes. We didn't have much of anything because depression years, my mother could hardly put food on the table. Never name. I can remember the first coat I bought out of a real store. I remember the first dress I ever got to buy when I was a teenager out of a real store. I didn't wear hand-me-downs anymore. I got to buy a real dress, all my own. And those are the kind of things you grew up, so you didn't expect all that. So when we went out in ministry, we didn't expect all that. We'd already been through these amazingly hard years of our generation. So we were very prepared just to get from place to place and preach the gospel and don't buy any new clothes and just do what we were supposed to do. But we're a prosperous nation anymore, in spite of the fact of what a lot of people say. We're still a prosperous nation. I knew very few rich people back then. And now you look at most families, they have lovely homes. I have a lovely home. And but we grew up in poverty. And we didn't know we were poor because everybody else was poor too. We didn't think much about it. I can remember chasing my brother-in-law for blocks for a nickel. And I don't know where he got the nickel because they didn't have any money either. Because I could go to a little store up by me on 19th Street in Santa Monica. And they had what they call Lucky Bites. They were little caramel things about that long, and they came all packed in a box. Well, if you bit into one and it had a pink center, you got a nickel candy bar. Well, I learned where they were in the box, and the guy that owned the store liked me. I was like 9, 10 years old. He'd let me go pick my own, and I'd get the corner ones. And sometimes out of 5, I'd spend that nickel, I'd get 5, I'd get 4 candy bars. Because I kind of knew where to find those, the ones with the pink centers. And that was a big thing. I mean, I can remember my mother and I going marketing. We had to walk, it was Piggly Wiggly Market, which later became Safeway, up on Wilshire Boulevard in Santa Monica, and we had to walk home with our groceries, and we didn't have very much to walk home with. One time she bought a watermelon. I was so excited. I was probably about 8. She put it up on the counter. She said, "Don't touch this because it's heavy." I said, "Okay," but I wanted to hold it so bad. So I remember going over, imagine that, a watermelon. I went over to the sink and I gathered that up in my arms like this and I dropped it. And it split open on the floor, and my mother came in. She said, "I told you not to pick up that watermelon." I said, "But I just wanted to hold it, Mama. I just wanted to hold it for a minute." We ate it. I mean, it wasn't ruined. We could eat it. But those are the kind of things I remember out of the Depression years. And my mother made icebox cookies, I remember, because we couldn't buy store-bought cookies. Of course, there were no packaged meals. So they were wonderful years. We learned how to adjust, and we learned that you didn't have to have everything to be happy. You didn't have to have everything in life to, now kids have to have video games and their own televisions and so many things, but we didn't have to in those days. We made our own fun, and Sunday was Sunday. We sat and sewed or did something on Sunday. My girlfriend lived next door, one of them, and we'd sit down under her tree in her front yard and sew on Sundays, make little things sewing, because it was a quiet day. That was God's day back then. So a lot has changed, huh?
Yeah, it has. Some good and some bad.
Yeah, people in my generation, though, we all just were so grateful to be alive. We were so glad to see our boys come home. And you'd walk down the streets, and there would be a little flag in the windows, about this big. And if it was a blue flag with a gold star, that meant, or 2 stars, 3 stars, that meant that they had that many people in the armed forces. The mothers would hang it in the window. When a boy died, it was replaced with a white flag with a gold star. So you knew when you went by a house and saw a white flag with a gold star, they had lost a child or a husband or someone in that home. And so many reminders of the war years, you know. And because I lived in a beach city, we saw the ships come in with wounded and also, we always managed to get, we girls always seemed to manage to get down near the ships when the fleet was coming in, because all the boys would be coming in, you know, the well ones as well as the hurt ones, and so you could be surrounded by Navy guys, and that was great sport. So we always kind of made it our business to get down there when we knew the ship was coming in. But we watched someone we never saw come home, and others did, but some were never the same. I know a couple of boys from church were never the same. They came home well, but they fought in the Battle of the Bulge. They fought in foxholes. And in those days, they talk now about, and I feel for the women who have husbands in Iraq, and they're gone 3 to 6 months or so, but in those days, they'd be gone maybe 3 years. I had 2 friends who were pregnant when their husbands left, and those men never saw their child till they were 3 years old. They were gone, unless they got hurt and got sent home or to another area to be to get well. So they would be gone a long time, and some of them that came back whole as far as their physical bodies never were quite the same in their hearts and in their minds. They just, I know I said something, he wouldn't talk much, his name was Don, he wouldn't talk much about the war. And I said, Don, it must have been awful. The only thing he said, and it's the only thing he ever said to me, it's not easy when you see your comrades die in a foxhole and you come out of it in the same foxhole unhurt. You're never the same, and that's all he ever said. So, and I don't know, I haven't seen him for 40 years. I don't know if he ever worked through that in his life. I really don't know. But a lot of them came home more scarred than they would have battle-scarred as far as their bodies. They came home very scarred in their hearts and their minds and their spirits. It was a horrible thing. And the ones especially that got taken into Japanese prison camps and stuff, they suffered untold atrocities. So those were hard years, but they were also glorious years. There was a lot of patriotism, and we trusted God more than we'd ever trusted in our lives to feed us during the Depression and then to keep our boys during the war. So my whole life in my young growing up years was all my life, from the time I was a little girl, 3 years old, until the war ended when I was 20. That was my life, those years.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was an amazing time. You couldn't even walk. It was so black when the blackouts came. If you're walking down the street, you might as well just try to find a place on somebody's lawn. But then here come the air raid wardens. And they'd say, why aren't you in? And we'd say, well, we just, on our way home from church, we don't know where to go. We can't see to get home. We can't go back, can't see to go back. I can't remember what, my mother and I got stuck in a couple of those once. And I can't remember what we did about that, if they just had somebody take us in or what we did. But you had to be inside with the lights out or your heavy black shades up to the window, which we all had heavy black shades. So there was not a smidgen of light anywhere. It was black at night.
Wow, that is
Yeah.
amazing. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine that now. But
It is living in this country, isn't it? And I think especially living in a coast community, living at a beach like we did, I could hear ack-ack guns, they called them ack-ack guns, shooting sometimes during these blackouts. And I didn't know if it was them or us. You know, you don't know who it is. You assume it's us, but you're not positive. As I said, a couple of times they took out a couple of submarines out here in the Pacific, not far off the coast from where I lived. I didn't live on the coast. My girlfriend did. She heard a lot more than I did, but I heard enough 19 blocks away from the coast, you know, to scare me to death. And it was scary. And when you heard that all clear signal go, you're like, whew, you know, we're okay again. Because who knew? If they got us at Pearl Harbor, they could get us anywhere. So who knew, you know? I still have a hard time looking at the Japanese flag. I don't mind the people. We have missionary flags in our church, and I always sit on that side, and the Japanese flag's right over here, this big white flag with this big red sun in the middle. And I don't look at it anymore, and I have to because it still irritates me. Isn't that stupid? I'm 79 years old. I told my pastor, I said, I hate looking at that flag. He said, you need to sit on the other side of the church. I said, I don't want to sit over there. But he said, boy, you're hold a grudge a long time. I said, no, I don't mind the people, but the flag really irks me because every time you'd see those zeros coming in on Pearl Harbor or anywhere, you could see this big, huge red ball on the side of their planes and stuff, you know, and you knew that was trouble. And so I never got quite over that flag.
Well, thank you for...
German flag didn't bother me. I don't know why that one didn't bother me. Fighting them too, but... Oh, you're very welcome. I hope in all of that there's something you can use.
Oh, yeah. So, I'm sure. I appreciate you letting us come into your
Oh,
home.
my, you're so
And
welcome.
doing this. And tell Bill hi for me.
I will.
I haven't seen him for a while.
I got on his case for reporting me. I said, you reported me to somebody. Now they're going to come out and interview me, and I'm nervous.